Hezbollah says it's close to securing the Lebanese border. Is the group calling the shots over the country's military? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is Hezbollah. Lebanon's military has been gearing up for a major operation to push Daesh off its border with Syria. Commanders planned for an attack so decisive, rights groups warned that refugees would be caught in the crossfire. But then the Lebanese group Hezbollah announced it's already getting the job done, saying its fight against militancy in the area is nearly over. Lebanon's Prime Minister says his army is not involved, but there are conflicting reports on whether that's true. It has us asking, in Lebanon's fight against Daesh, who's really in control? We'll debate that question with our guests in a moment, but first, here's Randolph Nogel.
It's a battle to secure the Lebanese border and drive out hundreds of militants allied with Daesh and Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, a former al-Qaeda affiliate. The powerful Lebanese militia, Hezbollah, is leading the fight. But the drive to reclaim the area, which straddles eastern Lebanon and western Syria, has raised concerns over the safety of tens of thousands of refugees in the nearby city of Arsal. Earlier this month, Hezbollah brokered a deal to return 250 refugees in Arsal to Syria. But the fate of many more is uncertain. Lebanon's army has carried out raids in Arsal's refugee camps to root out alleged militants, using them as a safe haven. There have been reports that some of those detained in the raids were tortured.
في الداخل لا خوف من داخل المخيمات ما في خوف من الخارج الجيش اللبناني الطوق الأمني الذي يفرضه الجيش اللبناني لا يمكن هناك استحالة أن يخترق أحد حواجز أو الخطوط الأمنية للجيش اللبناني.
And while Prime Minister Saad Hariri has said the Lebanese army is preparing its own offensive, there are reports it will only defend its positions around Arsal. Hezbollah remains controversial within Lebanese society, but the Shia militia could be seen as better suited to battle the very groups they have fought in Syria. And while they appear to be making gains, for many refugees, the violence that caused them to leave their homes has continued to follow them. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, I'm joined now from Beirut by retired Lebanese Army General Ilyas Farhat, and also from Beirut is Mona Alami. She's a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council and Trends Research covering security issues. And finally, Middle East political commentator Halim Shibaya, who joins us also from Beirut. Thanks all of you for joining us. General Farhat, is Hezbollah calling the shots here? Are they doing the bulk of the fighting?
The task of Hezbollah is fighting the Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a Qaeda-affiliated group deployed in the stronghold in the countryside of the town of Arsal in northeast Lebanon. It is an arid area and a mountain. They are deployed in Syrian side and Lebanese side of the eastern series of mountains, which is the border between Lebanon and Syria. So far, the al-Nusra have digged tunnels and centers of operations and a lot of strongholds in the mountain area. So Hezbollah launched this offensive against the positions of the al-Nusra based on a reconnaissance, which I think lasted months in order to determine exactly the targets that it will attack.
Okay, so Mona Alami, how come the Lebanese army is not spearheading this thing? I mean, if we look at it, this is Jabhat Fatah al-Sham and Daesh. There's very little doubt about these groups. It's not as if some people support them and some nations consider them legitimate fighters and so on. Why is the Lebanese army sitting back and allowing Hezbollah to do all of this fighting?
I think there is a division of roles between the Hezbollah and the Lebanese army. It's been very difficult for the government to decide on this assault on Arsal because of the sectarian divide that crosses Lebanon. There wasn't an agreement around this, the launch of the operation, which meant that the Lebanese army's role was primarily to secure the defense lines in Arsal, protect the refugee camps and Arsal village of any infiltration of any terrorists from Jabhat al-Nusra or from Daesh.
Halim Shibaya, is a byproduct all of this going to be that there's going to be a Hezbollah corridor all the way from Lebanon through Syria? They support Assad, they fight on behalf of Assad in Syria. Is Hezbollah going to come out of all of this if they win, as it is expected? Is it going to be that Hezbollah is much stronger across both borders?
Well, it is definitely a good time for Hezbollah, basically, because they entered the war in Syria and there was a division in Lebanon about support for their involvement in the Syrian war. So as is well known, a large portion of the Lebanese population was against Hezbollah's involvement in the civil war, and this partly explains why the Lebanese army also cannot be seen as taking part on any side of the Syrian civil war. But yes, definitely, in my opinion, this is a good time for Hezbollah from its own perspective, because its ability, if it comes out victorious, and which is likely to be from these battles, is that it will sort of confirm its own reading of why it went into the Syrian war, in that it went in to protect Lebanon. And here we see it as the way it's portraying itself as liberating these lands and returning them to the Lebanese armed forces and basically serving a national role. So I think from the perspective of Hezbollah, this is definitely a good time. But obviously for its critics, there are a lot of questions about whether that is in itself a good thing for Hezbollah to be taking the charge in that way.
Right. So we've been talking about strategy. We've been talking about political tactics and calculations and who benefits, right? But at the heart of all of this, we have people. We have a lot of innocent people, a lot of refugees, some of them double refugees, who have been doubly displaced, some of them Palestinian refugees for generations, and now they've been evicted from where they live. They're in danger. As our military man had mentioned, it is a very difficult terrain. It's mountainous. Amnesty International is worried. Let me draw your attention to what Amnesty International says. They say the Lebanese army must ensure that the operation is carried out in a manner that protects the right to life and other human rights. Use of explosive weapons in these circumstances would be contrary to Lebanon's obligations under international law and likely to lead to arbitrary deaths. Ilyas Farhat, is the Lebanese army and Hezbollah, whoever's fighting Daesh and whoever's fighting Jabhat Fatah Sham, are they taking all necessary precautions to ensure that civilians don't get killed?
Yes, sir. Amnesty International should have been aware of that the deployment of those terrorist organizations, which are labeled by the United Nations and even by the United States State Department, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they are deployed in a mountain area. There are no civilians, no villages, even no trees, no forests. It is a stronghold. It's not a city as Raqqa or Mosul or anything else. So the fight is definitely against the stronghold of terrorist organizations.
But Mr. Farhat, what about the refugees? Where are they?
In Arsal.
I'm sorry. You say they're fighters in the mountains, but I mean, yes. all available evidence seems to show that all the way.
Let me continue.
Hold on, just for a second. But I just wanted to jump in for a second because you made a point that I want to clarify here, if you don't mind. From the Lebanese side all the way to the Syrian side, it seems to be that from Arsal all the way across Syria, you have refugees. You're saying that they're just fighters that they're targeting. My understanding is that the fighters are among the refugees.
Okay, sir. The camps of the refugees are outside Arsal and outside the stronghold. In between them, the Lebanese army is deployed on the hills overlooking the situation. And the main task for the Lebanese army in this operation is to prevent the Al-Qaeda affiliated group to enter these camps. They attempted 4 times, and the Lebanese army fired on them and foiled their attempt in order to get into the camps, in order to make resorts in the camps and the refugees, and turn the operation from an operation against Al-Qaeda affiliated group into an operation against the civilians. So the Lebanese army task is very crucial and very sensitive, and so far they succeeded in preventing these terrorist groups in order to infiltrate to the camps of the refugees.
Okay, so Mona, is it that easy between Arsal and Fleita and the Qalamoun Mountains and all of that to be able to distinguish between the fighters' strongholds and where the civilians are, and to ensure that nobody who's innocent, who doesn't deserve it, doesn't get killed?
Yeah. Look, I'm going to expand a bit on what the general said. It is true that refugee camps are mostly around Arsal and in Arsal, away from where the battles are taking place. However, I think in the aftermath of Arsal, the Lebanese government will have to face the question of what was going to happen with the Syrian refugees. There is an accumulation of tensions between Lebanese and Syrian refugees, and I'm talking about Lebanese of all sects. We're also seeing hate crime going on in Lebanon. We've seen the video of a Syrian that was being beaten and humiliated by Lebanese. We've seen the incident that happened during the raid of the mysterious death of 4 Syrian refugees during the raid on Arsal camp, when there were 5 suicide bombers that detonated their explosive vest. So this is causing an accumulation, and we've seen also that ISIS has been able to infiltrate Syrian refugees. Given the very hard living conditions these Syrian refugees are living in Lebanon, given that there is no decision of what to do with them, I think that this accumulation and the infiltration might increase and might pose a greater threat in terms of security condition. And that's a very grave question. But however, I would like to also add to what Halim was saying about Hezbollah. Something that he didn't mention is that Hezbollah now, with the Jord of Arsal, is going to be able to secure a safe zone that stretches from Qusayr to Zabadani. And that's a region that Hezbollah has mostly control over. And I think that's a main concern for Hezbollah and a big victory for it.
Yeah, okay. Interesting addition to that. Halim, let me ask you about the Lebanese army's track record then, and the track record of trying to root out extremists. I remember when we covered Nahr al-Barid in 2007, they pummeled that Palestinian refugee camp because there were extremists among them. This is predating Daesh, predating some of the contemporary troubles. It took 5 or 6 years before the camp was rebuilt, and there wasn't really a plan for those Palestinian refugees. With that in mind, can people be forgiven for being very skeptical about what comes next for those refugees and the civilians in Arsal?
Well, the hope is that, as was mentioned by the general, is that we hope that the Lebanese army will be able to protect these refugee camps, and the big hope, and hopefully that the refugee camps will not become involved in these fightings, because I think once there would be any fightings coming from within the camps, then it becomes extremely difficult to differentiate, as you were asking, between fighters and civilians. And as you well know, in armed conflicts and in wars, one of the main criteria is to try to distinguish between civilians and combatants, those who are taking part in the hostilities, those who aren't. So at the moment, from the media reports that I am able to see that are coming out from these from the military operations, it seems that at the moment they are limited to fighters in the mountainous areas. So hopefully the army will be able to keep protecting it. I think this time around the army has a knowledge that it's important to differentiate between the refugees and the armed forces. So yesterday, from the fighters. So yesterday I saw there were pictures coming out from these areas showing the army helping refugees, showing the army carrying, helping the refugees flee from certain areas. So I think there is a bit more awareness that it is important to have an appreciation that refugees should not become involved in the fighting because we do not want more innocent people. And you did mention Nahr al-Bared, which was, yes, unfortunate because it is extremely hard to be able to, once you start bombing these camps, to differentiate between civilians and fighters. But at this point, I think, at this point in the fighting, I'm in the studio now, I'm not sure what will happen next, but it seems that it's under control.
And Mona, as we look at the effects on Lebanese society, at the beginning of the Syrian war, we saw that the refugees flooded across. And then we saw Hezbollah get involved with Assad. So then some Lebanese went to the war. And now we're seeing the war almost coming to Lebanon itself. It's on the border. Do you expect it to encroach deeper into Lebanon? And to what extent has that war fundamentally divided Lebanese society on sectarian and political lines?
Yeah, I think that there is a big divide along sectarian lines when it comes to the Syrian war. However, I think the Lebanese are also very worried of the expansion of any terrorist threat in Lebanon. This is why I think that the narrative of Hezbollah is gaining more resonance among, for example, not just its traditional base, which is the Shiite popular base, but more among Christians, because its narrative that it's fighting, takfiris and terrorists, as well as the Israelis in Syria, when it does operation like Arsal, well, it kind of gains in legitimacy and credibility. But as I told you before, I think that despite the division around the issue of the Syrian war, tensions between Syrian refugees and Lebanese are across all sects. And this is what is worrying. There are limited resources, and people and Syrian refugees are competing with Lebanese on these limited resources and employment opportunities. And this is where the threat is in terms of tensions.
General Ilyas Farhat, has this war divided your country and your society further?
I don't think so. There is a division, but a slight division, because there is more consensus in the Lebanese society against these terrorist organizations, because the Hezbollah and the Lebanese army are targeting ISIS and targeting Al-Qaeda. As to the video that Mona talked about, which shows the Lebanese are hitting, striking a Syrian, you cannot judge on a small video. The Lebanese people are 3.5 million. They received 2 million Syrians. They divided the schools between the Syrians and the Lebanon. They allowed them to work through all over Lebanon. They don't take any money for their permit or for their residence cards. So we treat them well, and so you cannot judge on this separate incident to see that there is something in Lebanon. The best country which the Syrian refugees are dealt is Lebanon. It's not Turkey, no, and never Jordan. Ask themselves. But now nowadays some people are exploiting the Syrian refugees. Suddenly they love them. And suddenly because the ISIS and Al-Qaeda are under attack now, so in order to make some shadow situation, to shadow the situation, they are talking about the Syrian refugees,
but
the Lebanese army, the Lebanese state, the Lebanese people,
General
from
Farhat,
all,
we have to ask
from
about
all
this.
confessions.
Certainly.
They are keen to protect.
But
the
we have
Syrian
to ask about this,
refugees,
right?
all the
Certainly,
people.
But we can't give.
Yes,
whether the Lebanese army, whether it's the Lebanese army or whether it is Hezbollah, right? We can't give it a blank check and say, okay,
yes,
you're fighting ISIS, so do whatever you want to. We have to be able to ask questions. Do you agree with that?
Can I
yes, we welcome all your questions. We have to make it clear for you.
Okay, you welcome the questions, Mona?
I'm not.
Okay.
Yeah, what I'm saying is not based on one video. I've done several studies on Syrian refugees and their impact on their Lebanese environment. I've been to Arsal several times. I've been to North Lebanon. I've been to the Bekaa where they reside. And I see these tensions. We've seen the crackdown of municipalities on businesses opened by Syrians. I'm not saying that I don't understand these policies, but I think that the fact that these tensions are rising is something of a threat. That's my position.
General Farhat, doesn't that sound reasonable?
Of course, the main reason of Brexit is that the Polish came to London and opened shops with cheaper prices. So it is normal that 2 million refugees out of 3.5 million Lebanese, what Mona said is real. The municipalities, but you know, it's a big burden on all the Lebanese. So you have to understand the Lebanese, how to regulate and to organize those people. But anyway, they are dealt with. They enjoy. Free medical services in the in the state hospitals, and they. You know, the number is very large. Whenever you go in Lebanon, you find a lot of refugees here and there. So you have to do something. And you know that the Lebanese government is not allowed to deport any Syrian from Lebanon. Even the Syrian people who commit crimes and enter prison for 3 or 4 months, when they discharge from the prison, they are not allowed. The government is not allowed to deport them.
Okay, and to be clear, General Farhat, nobody is saying here that the Lebanese army is doing a bad job, that Lebanese society is treating Syrian refugees badly. The country is choked, it's creaking, it's trying very hard to deal with a mess, and of course its population has been increased by so much, by about 30% since the beginning of the Syrian war. Having said all of that, we welcome you coming on the program, and we welcome the opportunity to ask further questions if civilians are being killed, if refugees are under threat, and so on. That's why we've had the debate. I appreciate having you on the program, Sir General Ilyas Farhat, also Mona Alami and Halim Shebaya. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
I've got to move on. Thank you so much. Still ahead, we'll have more on the Lebanese group Hezbollah, but this time halfway across the world, in Venezuela. Are allegations it's operating there true? And scientists say the world is drowning in plastic. How did we get here? Welcome back to the Newsmakers. As Hezbollah shows its military might in Lebanon, the group could also be influencing events halfway around the world. The U.S. accuses the nation's vice president, Tareck El Aissami, of being a drug trafficker with ties to Hezbollah. So does Venezuela's government have ties to the group, or is it a smear campaign? Sandra Gatman explores.
The allegations have been around for years.
Venezuela estaría sirviendo de trampolín para que personas vinculadas con el grupo terrorista Hezbollah puedan entrar a Estados Unidos y Canadá.
That Venezuela's leftist government is harboring ties to the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah. A relationship cemented by the country's late president Hugo Chavez and his friendship with Iran, and continued under his successor Nicolás Maduro. Politically, Venezuela and Hezbollah have made no secret of their mutual admiration. When late President Hugo Chavez called former U.S. President George Bush a devil, Hezbollah supporters waved his photo at rallies in Beirut. On the streets of Venezuela, Hezbollah was praised for its offensive against Israel during the 2006 war. Back then, Venezuela's current vice president, Tareck El Aissami, was a congressman.
Hoy la causa árabe se abraza con la causa de la revolución bolivariana.
Some Washington lawmakers have warned about Hezbollah's supposed reach posing a security threat.
A nation that is trafficking and selling passports and travel documents to individuals with links to terrorism. And that poses a direct threat to the national security of the United States.
And for more than a decade, the U.S. State Department has consistently found that Venezuela has maintained a permissive environment that allowed for supportive activities that benefited known terrorist groups, including Hezbollah supporters and sympathizers. But reported links between Venezuela and Hezbollah are nebulous, wide-ranging, and tough to prove. Today, Vice President Tareck El Aissami, who has Syrian and Lebanese origins, has become the focus of investigations into Venezuela's links to Hezbollah. A study in 2014 found that El Aissami has developed a sophisticated and multi-level financial network that functions as a criminal terrorist pipeline for bringing Islamic radicals to Venezuela and its neighbors, and to send illegal funds from Latin America to the Middle East. The investigation also linked El Aissami to a passport scheme that sold hundreds of Venezuelan IDs to people from the Middle East while he was Interior Minister between 2008 and 2012. Some of the evidence came from a Venezuelan diplomat turned whistleblower.
Por ello pagaban cantidades entre 5 y 15 mil dólares. Muchas veces estaban vinculados a grupos terroristas, en su mayoría de tendencia chiita.
Last February, the U.S. Treasury officially blacklisted El Aissami as a specially designated narcotics trafficker. Maduro's government has vehemently denied any links to the drug trade and terrorist groups. His supporters dismiss the accusations as fake news, blaming the CIA for trying to build a political case against the Venezuelan leadership. With U.S. President Trump threatening new sanctions against Caracas, Venezuela says Washington's ultimate goal is regime change. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Joseph Humeyer. He is the founder of the Center for a Secure Free Society, a national security think tank, and co-author of Iran's Strategic Penetration in Latin America. And from Beirut, political commentator Marwa Osman. She's a lecturer at the Lebanese International University and Ma'arif University. And in studio, the Newsmakers correspondent Sandra Gatman, whose voice you just heard a few moments ago. Thanks all of you for joining us. Joseph, let me begin with you. Looking at this story, there's a claim that the vice president of Venezuela, Tareck El Aissami, is connected to Hezbollah, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evidence. Make the case. Tell me what's the evidence.
Well, you know, one of the biggest money laundering cases in the history of Latin America actually took place not too long ago, within the last decade, where the DEA arrested a major money launderer, Lebanese money launderer in Latin America named Ayman Juma. This case, which moved multi-million dollars and multi-ton shipments of cocaine from Latin America to the Middle East, went through the Lebanese Canadian bank and went through a used car scheme basically to launder the money. That case, which has been indicted in a federal court, which was connected to Hezbollah through the Lebanese Canadian bank, is also connected to Tareck El Aissami, because Tareck El Aissami has a money laundering network that spreads throughout about 12 different countries throughout Latin America into the Middle East, and that money laundering network has been capitalized on by Hezbollah. He doesn't have, it's important to distinguish that Tareck El Aissami, no one has ever said, at least I haven't heard anyone say that he is Hezbollah, but he has connections to Hezbollah, and one of the people that has connected him to Hezbollah is one of the former Venezuelan diplomats, Ghazi Nasruddin, who's also wanted by the FBI and who's also sanctioned by the Department of Treasury for his connections to the Lebanese terrorist group.
Okay, so Marwa, when you hear that, does that sound solid, or does it sound like a conspiracy theory concocted in the DC Beltway?
It's a nice fairy tale, I could tell you, with the names and the name of the bank and everything that's put together by FBI and CIA files. It's even more interesting when you talk about other names, other big businessmen names in Lebanon, especially those who are from South Lebanon who work also with Africa and also with Latin America. You could use so many stories to try and create some sort of a story against anyone. You could literally make a big lie against anyone. We could start by the bank, the Canadian bank that was actually closed due to the U.S. influence against this bank that forced the Lebanese government to close the bank. Actually, what happened is that bank is used by multiple Lebanese Shias, who are literally Lebanese from the south part of Lebanon, where it is called El Hezbollah stronghold, which is, by the way, not. And they use that bank, which is also partly owned by someone who is a Shia. So it's more of a PR campaign that went on, that these businessmen started using that bank. And obviously, they have companies all across the globe. Yes, we do have billionaires, despite the fact that I'm against capitalism. But yes, we do have billionaires. And they started using this bank as part of their transactions for their companies. Now, whether or not the U.S. or the U.S. intelligence would like to believe if that's the case or not, that's
Marwa, let me come in for a second. Let me ask you,
different, because
Marwa, why would the U.S. Treasury be sanctioning this individual, the vice president, and be making the case that there's a connection Why would they be doing this if there wasn't something solid?
Let us start by the possibility of, let us start by saying that there's, yes, of course, there might be a possibility of a certain relationship between any part of the Latin American cultures or governments with the Lebanese resistance, Hezbollah. That's part of the culture. The culture there is also a culture of resistance against American imperialism. So is the culture of Hezbollah. So that's only a matter of normalcy. That's something normal to have such connections. I mean, even if we go back in time, even Che Guevara himself had connections
so let me take that.
Abdel Nasser himself.
Okay, so you say culturally.
It is part of a revolution.
Okay, so Joseph, enemy of my enemy is my friend. We like you. We have the same enemies. Fine, we're doing business together, but that doesn't mean anything nefarious is happening. Might that be the case, Joseph?
No, the nefarious things already happened. We can't forget that Hezbollah has been accused and seriously accused in Argentina of bombing one of the biggest terrorist attacks in Latin America's history, especially the largest Islamic terrorist attack in Latin America's history. But let me make a point that PR campaigns, if this is a negative smear campaign, PR campaigns don't end with federal indictments and federal convictions. The cases that I'm talking about, the case on Ayman Juma was a federal conviction that was tried in a federal court here in New York, in the United States. That's not a PR campaign. That's an actual judicial case.
If your law says that they are terrorists, it doesn't mean that they are. If your law, if your court states
not just
that
our
this
law.
person is a terrorist,
There's more than 30 countries around the world
your court
that have
is
indicted
stating,
Hezbollah.
for example, there are groups in Syria that are not terrorists, at the same time they are killing people.
I don't want to get into the discussion.
Obviously, you're going to hate Hezbollah because it has stand against Israel. You're going to hate Hezbollah because it has been standing against
if you'll allow me to come in for a second,
Hezbollah is a terrorist group around the world.
Joseph, give me a second. I don't want to get into the discussion as to whether Hezbollah is a terrorist organization or not, because I don't think that's the focus of the discussion. What we're trying to understand here is if Hezbollah is doing bad stuff in Venezuela right now, which is claimed by the opposition. I want you to listen to what the Venezuelan opposition leader, Enrique Capriles, had to say. Have a listen to this, and I'll come back to all of you after that. Take a listen.
If the vice president has any dignity, he should resign in the next few hours. We request that prosecutors, the powers that you all know are controlled by Maduro's government, open an investigation into such serious accusations. We request all the information held by the United States to determine where the responsibility lies here.
Okay, and Sandra's next to me here. Sandra, you've been to Venezuela recently. The country is going through a tough period. It's extremely polarized. It's divided. The opposition undoubtedly jumping on this ever since January, February. Tell me how much this information about foreign meddling or Hezbollah connection is dividing the society and is being used as a political football in the country.
I think the issue of foreign meddling plays into the hands of both the government and the opposition. The government claimed that any accusations of drug trafficking, corruption, human rights abuses are all used as a pretext by governments like the US and other Western leaders to meddle in Venezuelan affairs. On the other hand, you have the opposition saying Cuba, which has very close relations with Venezuela, is an imperialist force in the hemisphere as well, and that Iran has played a strong hand in Venezuelans' affairs as well. So this is always going to be political in Venezuela. And I think while the issue of the link between the Venezuelan government and Hezbollah as an organization and a group itself hasn't really been talked about, what the Venezuelan people are interested in is money laundering, drug trafficking, and where millions and millions of dollars of Venezuelan money are going. And if that link to Hezbollah explains that, then the Venezuelan opposition are going to continue leaping on this. They have since February, when those sanctions were dropped by the US government. If anything else comes about, they will certainly use this to their advantage.
Okay, so Joseph, what we're seeing happening here? The opposition saying we're against an Iranian/Cuban imperialism in our country, whereas the government saying we're anti-Yankee imperialism, and you've got two competing narratives. Which one do you think has more evidence? You're obviously in the camp that thinks the Iranians and Cubans story checks out more.
Well, I mean, I think if you go to Venezuela, it's very clear that the government itself hasn't aligned itself with the United States. The United States has diminished its presence in terms of just personnel and activities in Venezuela. The DEA got kicked out, the defense attaches, the military group got kicked out. So the United States doesn't have the presence it has in Venezuela that it had many years ago, while at the same time, Iran, but not just Iran, Russia, China, their presence has increased over the last decade and a half. So I think, you know, the evidence has just showed on the level of you know, economic, diplomatic, and financial footprint in the country. But beyond that, I would just touch on a point that you mentioned earlier about the nefarious side of this. So the vice president that we were talking about, Tareck El Aissami, beyond having the money laundering network, he's been accused of establishing an immigration pipeline that moves from illicit funds and drugs from Latin America to the Middle East and brings back foreign fighters. There's been cases that have been documented and proved that have shown suspected members of Hezbollah using this pipeline to change their identities, to basically say they're no longer Lebanese or Syrian, to actually become Venezuelans.
Okay, again, so Marwa, let me ask you, is there any amount of evidence that could be shown to you that would convince you that something wrong is going on?
Let us start by actually showing evidence. Let him show me evidence, and I'm all for listening, but there's no evidence on the ground. When you say that they are changing their personality, why? Where are they going? They are fighting either Israel or the Takfiris in Syria. And look, the usual U.S. scenario or the usual U.S. story is, oh, if they're not with us, they're definitely against us. Your guest was saying there is more presence for Russian, Chinese, and other Middle Eastern or Iranian, Persian presence in Venezuela. So what's wrong with that if they are trying to have economic ties or diplomatic ties? But that's what's wrong with that is that the U.S. doesn't want that to happen, because the U.S. wants to stay in monopoly, whether in power or in economics. Right. But that's not the case here. The case is, well, there's Hezbollah, the Hezbollah that has been fighting Israel, that has been fighting U.S. imperialism, that has led ISIS and Nusra, put literally their noses in the dirt in Syria. They have been doing this right now as we speak in Arsal on the Lebanese border with Syria as well, and they have been able to liberate the area which has been taken by ISIS and Nusra for 6 years.
And we have been talking about it, certainly.
Days. So I know this is a huge...
I don't want to, again, I don't want to go into the successes and failures of Hezbollah, and we have been talking about...
I'm telling you why they would pin...
Certainly, and I got it.
I'm trying to describe to you, or to explain to you why they are trying to pin this on Hezbollah. Well, I'll continue. Yes, obviously, there must be some sort of diplomatic relations, as I told you, whether with Hugo Chavez before he passed away, or with Maduro right now, or with his vice president. What's so wrong with that? What's so wrong with that is that it's not being part of the U.S. game anymore, so that's why the U.S. will go overboard to try and pin anything against Hezbollah.
You see nefarious intent in those who are making the accusation. Now, Joseph has been bringing up very specific cases here, and that's to your credit, Joseph. Let me ask you then, Joseph, if it hurts...
Let me bring up
Joseph, hold
case.
on for a second. Let me ask you. You've been bringing up some very specific individuals in specific cases. Does it hurt your case when you read about people mentioning that Iran and Hezbollah have military camps actually within Venezuela, that the Iranians are mining uranium within Venezuela and that sort of thing, because those things have been proven to be falsehoods. So does it hurt the point you're trying to make when that sort of stuff gets pushed out?
There's two ways, there's two wrong reactions to understanding the problem set. One is to over-exaggerate and to state things that aren't true, or to jump to conclusions on things that perhaps aren't conclusive. And the other wrong reaction is to underestimate what they're doing. And so if I were to take an assessment, I would say we were moving more towards the latter. We have been underestimating their presence, not overreacting to their presence, which is how they've been able to increase. And you know, I have been bringing up very specific examples because they asked for evidence. I'll give you another piece of evidence, and this has to do with specifically the documentation. If this had nothing to do with the United States, if it all had to do with Israel and what Hezbollah has their priorities in the Middle East, then why was one of the individuals that was linked to the 9/11 bombing, one of the individuals linked to the 9/11 bombing, a Palestinian who's connected to Hezbollah, given a Venezuelan document and sent later to Jordan? That case was examined not by me, not by U.S. authorities, it was examined by a Venezuelan government official.
Since 9/11 up until now, I've never heard any piece of evidence that says Hezbollah is linked
him up. His name is Hakeem Dia
because it's linked to your brothers in the Gulf.
Look him up. His name's Hakeem Dia Fatah. He was arrested in a Jordanian court and
Why
was
should
mentioned
I
in the
care? I know
Jordanian
the
court
names
that he is from Hezbollah, Latin America.
And the IDs of the people who committed the crime of 9/11.
And I'm giving you evidence.
And trust me, our Hezbollah would not do that because they don't need to do that. You should look up your Saudi friends and your UAE friends.
I didn't say Hezbollah committed.
And
I didn't say Hezbollah committed 9/11. I say he was linked to 9/11 by taking one of the schools in Florida, the pilot schools, with Ani and Noor.
How can that be any sort of evidence?
Okay, well, we're all going to look at it.
Anyone who committed any crime can have a family member who actually works in Hezbollah. How can that be an evidence?
He made a point. We'll look at it. I mean, maybe we'll have him back on the show, you know, if there's much more to this. Let me ask you, Sandra, about this claim now that former US President Barack Obama stopped an investigation into links with, between Iran, Venezuela, and Hezbollah. This was reported by a Spanish newspaper, ABC, from a former Obama administration official, right, an insider. So this was sort of to preserve the Iran deal, to preserve those relations, warming relations with Cuba. This was the claim. It can't be absolutely verified independently. But tell me how that news has played out, Sandra, in the past, week and a half since it came out.
Well, what we can take from that revelation, or the alleged revelation that Obama had, under Obama, there was an investigation into links, specific links between Venezuela and the financing of Hezbollah. The fact that there was now a shift under President Trump, that as soon as he took office in February, sanctions were placed on El Aissami, and that a change in policy was markedly seen. I think that just escalates the political rhetoric. You have Donald Trump now up against President Nicolás Maduro. Nicolás Maduro is saying, get out of Venezuela. Trump now re-escalating, saying we will place new sanctions on more of your top officials. More than a dozen officials in the Venezuelan government are already sanctioned if Venezuela goes on with this new constituent assembly. So we're seeing a ramping up of tension between the two countries, and politically, I think this could be very toxic for both sides.
I must say, you know, this story, I was a little bit nervous about it because there were a lot of tenuous threads here. Nothing was absolutely rock solid. But as we explored it, I'm really glad we had this conversation. It's an important conversation to have. Sandra, Marwa, and Joseph. Unfortunately, I've got to move on, but thank you all for joining us.
Just in Indonesia alone, a country of population of 255 million people, if you're talking about straws alone, we're talking about 255 million people times 20 centimeters of plastic straw being discarded every single day. That is 5,000 kilometers of plastic being discarded on a daily basis. And that is equivalent the distance of Jakarta to Sydney.
Scientists are now warning that there is more than a ton of plastic garbage for every person on the planet. Corporations have produced more than 9 billion tons of plastic since 1950, according to the Journal of Science Advances. Only a fraction is recycled back into industries, leaving most of it to sit in landfills, oceans, lakes, and rivers. The problem is so severe that researchers have labeled the trash permanent pollution. Well, joining me now here in the studio is Hilal Elver. She's a United Nations Special Rapporteur on Right to Food, also a law professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara and Los Angeles campuses. Thanks so much for joining us, Ms. Elver. So we're wasting and dumping food when hundreds of millions starve. We're taking all these tons of trash and throwing them into the oceans and suffocating the oceans. Apart from that, I hear we're nice people. How bad is it?
I think it's very bad. The bad is we don't talk too much, even worse, because we don't have a real consciousness about what is happening because of this, especially plastics that in our environment. So it's very important to raise the consciousness that to take care of the problem, which is not possible to clean up. We can only stop.
So when I read in preparation for this, 1 million plastic bottles are bought around the world a minute. By 2050, according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the ocean will contain more plastic by weight than fish.
Yes.
I struggle to understand that. Why is it that I struggle to understand that? What's wrong with me?
Well, it is nothing wrong with you. Actually, this is the reality, which is very problematic. And in order to show the severity of the problem, they use this kind of figures to explain why it is so serious. That's why it's very serious if we understand the fish population is equal to population of the plastic waste is so incredibly important to understand. That's why the foundations and all the researchers try to make this kind of figures to make their point, which is many, many years they didn't do it.
Right, right. But so the suggestion is that, or the implication is that by 2050, if we carry on the way we're carrying on right now, the oceans will essentially be dead.
Well, oceans will be dead for many other reasons too. This is one of the reasons. You know, the climate change and fish stocks kind of depletion. These are all important problems. But what is important in the plastics, we cannot really reverse them. We cannot really go and collect from the ocean bed this kind of what is happening right now. Because basically the plastics are, half of them goes to the ocean, half of them goes to the landfill. When it goes to the landfill, there's an incineration or there's a recycling. If they go to ocean, we don't have this option anymore.
And fish eat them up. And
yes, and we actually practically eating the plastics.
Right.
That's very important and impressive that we don't even know the adverse effect to our health when we eat fish and all kind of seafoods, what kind of plastics we are taking in our body. And also same thing for the basically the bottles that we use drinking for water or sugar drinks. These bottles are plastic, and if it stays in the very hot or very cold temperature, then the chemicals comes to be part of the what is we are eating. So that's very serious.
It's really horrible, right?
Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned climate change, because what would you say to those people who say, okay, we accept that climate change is man-made, it's a real problem, it's an existential threat, let's deal with it. And now they've just come around to trying to deal with climate change, and now you're telling them, hey, we need to sort out the oceans and plastic. And what if they say, well, if that's more of a threat, can't we deal with this first and sort out your plastic story later?
Well, actually, plastics were earlier. That's very interesting, because this environmental pollutions came to our kind of conversation in 1960s, 70s. At that time, there was no climate change. We were not talking about the climate change, but climate change was so serious and important. When we started the climate change, we forget about many serious environmental problems. So that's very interesting that you raised this issue, which is more serious. Actually, they are really connected, because if we talk about the plastics are the oil production, you know, so more we use the plastic, more we are threatening the environment, the climate change, because the CO2 and the fossil fuel problems and the carbon production. So that is serious. We have to deal with every area of our life, not to really create a man-made disaster as fast as possible. And these plastics also are very interesting. It comes with the modernity. Before 1950s, there was not a problem about the plastics. After 1950, after the World War II, the chemical companies are started to become much more active, and then our lifestyles change. We started to eat in supermarket materials, which is supermarkets basically packaging, and many of the plastics, most of the plastics are going to the packaging. So that more we eat packaging food and more we drink the bottled waters, more we creating environment.
I've seen bananas in plastic covering. Now, I mean, think of that, right? That's the most insane thing I've ever seen in my life. Okay, so who's the biggest culprit, or who are the biggest culprits? Are they corporations, or are they countries, and who?
Altogether, we all are responsible. First of all, we are, as a consumers, we can make choices and changes.
But name someone.
Name someone?
Or some country or something.
Oh, well, the biggest...
I know we're all responsible, but who would you sort of say, hey,
biggest polluters.
Do more?
Okay, let me tell you about the plastics. Which country is the most pollutant in relation to plastics? Number 1 is China. Number 2 in Indonesia. Number 3 is Vietnam. And Turkey is 14. United States is 20. Why United States is 20? Because basically developed countries, they are polluting, but at the same time they are recycling and incinerating. But the countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, they have a lot of offshores, I mean the coastal regions. That's why they are sending a lot of polluted materials without making any kind of cleanup. So it's a basically rich country, poor country problem. Rich countries are producing more waste, but at the same time they have much more kind of sophistication that they can handle it. Despite this, only 20–30% of recycling and incineration is happening right now. 80%, 79% goes directly to the either landfill or ocean. This is incredible.
Right.
I mean, if you think about it.
Biggest corporation?
Yes.
That's a culprit?
Well, the chemical companies are culprit for anything.
Right.
This is one of them. Of course, the answer is this is the modern lifestyle. If you don't have a bottled water and if there is no clean water, how do you make the people drinking clean water?
Yes.
That's their argument.
Right.
So what we should do, we should bring the clean water to everyone else. The governments are responsible on that. So we all have to work together. Governments should regulate, corporations stop making so much profit, and we consumers are trying to consume more responsibly.
Hilal Elver, I've learned so much from you. Thank you very much for
joining us. Thank you very much.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Next time we debate whether war will break apart northern Syria. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.